Hello, everybody, and welcome to another Alfred Hitchcock Presents review. Today it is Season 1, Episode 38, The Creeper, starring Constance Ford as Ellen Grant and Steve Brodie as Steve Grant. And overall, I have to say this is an excellent episode of Season 1. Definitely one of my favorites and one of the best in my opinion. It's pretty fast-paced, and it packs in quite a few interesting characters in 25 minutes. And overall, when you consider when it was made in the mid 1950s, it's quite a great achievement in my opinion. So we start with two characters. There is a new janitor and a Mrs. Stone. And right away we learn that there's a killer still at large who's been terrorizing women in the neighborhood, basically. A pretty dark setup. And I have to say right away that both of these characters become suspects, as the janitor is just kind of a little bit strange, and Mrs. Stone says that the women that got it probably asked for it, so right away she shows to be pretty unsympathetic. And then we are introduced to our main character, Ellen, and we find out she needs a new lock because a lot of the women have been wanting stronger locks, basically, because of what's going on. And Mrs. Stone asks Ellen about staying alone and if she's nervous about it, and Ellen hasn't been feeling well, and you can tell she's nervous. So we go to the next scene, and we meet Ellen's husband, Steve, and he doesn't help matters. This guy's pretty crabby about everything. We find out because he didn't get a raise at work. It's also notable that he's on the night shift, so Ellen's home by herself. And Ellen asks him about the lock. He just keeps complaining about other things. They argue, and Ellen asks Steve if he can go on the day shift for a little bit. This really sets him off, so he gets upset and leaves, basically. Not a very sympathetic guy in this scene, and you even think that maybe he's the creeper. The episode does a good job of making pretty much every character other than Ellen a suspect. So at this point, Ellen calls the janitor about the lock because she's as nervous as ever. And he basically, I guess we'll get to it when he can get to it, which we'll find out won't be good enough for Ellen later on. So at this point, Mrs. Stone comes by and she tells Ellen just to keep you company. I know that you're alone. And Mrs. Stone doesn't seem worried at all about the creeper, about what's going on. And then she mentions that the creeper basically could be a woman, and that the women, that this happens to basically ask for it or deserve it in some way. I have to say Mrs. Stone is a very creepy character. So at this point, Steve is at a bar, and we meet this man named Ed, and they're talking about the creeper. It turns out that Ed works for the newspaper, so he knows a lot about this story. We also find out that Ed used to be married to Ellen, basically. Steve talks about the fight, and you can tell he's sorry for it, but he's definitely showing some erratic behavior, and Ed also seems to be a bit strange, like pretty much every character in this episode. We also learn at this point that both women who were victims of the creeper were home alone at night, and they were blonde, which is just like Ellen, so now Steve seems to be a little bit more concerned than he was. So at this point we get another scene which really doesn't lead anywhere, where Ellen goes to a man about her husband's shoes. He's a shoe man, I guess, and he's just another mislead, basically, but his character doesn't pop up again. So no big deal there, really. So at this point, Ellen goes home, and it's dark at night, and there's no lights, and George shows up in a very creepy scene. Very well done, I have to say. Once again, leading us to believe maybe George is the creeper. So but this really leads nowhere. George just puts in a new light bulb and leaves, but a very well done scene. So at this point, Ellen calls a Mr. Gibbons from the hardware store about the bolt and chain because she still doesn't have it. He says, we're very busy right now because of what's going on, but when we can get to it, we'll send someone over, basically. And I have to say, this scene is very subtle and seems almost just like a throwaway scene, but it's very important to the end of the episode, and it's subtle enough and done very well to really, really work. I really like this scene a lot. So at this point, ex-husband Ed shows up. He says Steve wanted him to come over because he was worried about Ellen. And they talk, and you can tell there's a lot of tension. They obviously didn't have a very good time when they were together. And Ed is very strange. He's coming on very strong. And at this point, we're thinking that maybe even Ed could be the creeper. Ed wants to dance. Ellen is concerned. She doesn't want anything to do with him. She tells Ed there's something wrong with him, and they talk about the relationship. Ed says that he's held some kind of grudge against her ever since they were married, which isn't good. He really taunts Ellen. He even kind of grabs her, and Ellen goes nuts, maybe a little over hysterical, but it works in the context of the episode. So at this point, it's broken up when the janitor and Mrs. Stone come in. Basically, the janitor's right there. Mrs. Stone's kind of lurking in the background. Ellen sends Ed away, basically. And when everybody else leaves, Mrs. Stone basically gets into a confrontation with Ellen again about how she tells her she's just like all the rest, basically going behind her husband's back with other men. Ellen tells her, you don't know what you're talking about. But I have to say, Mrs. Stone is strange all the way right to the end of this episode. So basically now Ellen's alone after George picks up the shoes she needs and leaves. And the man from the hardware store calls and says, I have the lock you need. So Ellen's very, very happy about this. She tells him her apartment number and to come right up. At this point, her husband Steve calls Ellen, and they're getting along a lot better. He apologizes for his behavior earlier, and he tells her to be very careful. And when there's a knock on the door, she's going to let the locksmith in, but Steve's telling her to wait, but she doesn't pay attention. She puts down the phone, basically. The locksmith comes in, and then she wants to be excused to talk to her husband, and Steve tells her, didn't you hear the latest broadcast? It appears that the creeper was the locksmith, so that makes sense. That's how he was getting into the apartments. And I have to say, the final scene of this episode is very disturbing, and things do not end well for Ellen. Let's just put it like that. A very dark ending, especially when you consider when this was made. Now, I do have a few small issues with this episode. One is that once you see it, the twist is really great, but it loses a little bit of impact on a second or third watch. It's still an excellent episode and very well done and entertaining. But once you know the surprise, I think it loses just a little bit. And a few of the scenes do seem to be just a little bit forced or staged as misleads. But I have to say, the locksmith being the creeper, I didn't really see it coming halfway through the episode when it was introduced. So it's very well done for the most part. So overall, I feel like The Creeper is definitely an essential episode and a must-see for all fans of the show, and I give it a 4.5 out of 5. So definitely a highlight of Season 1, and I would say a classic episode and a highlight of the show in general. So a 4.5 out of 5 for The Creeper, and as always, thank you very much for watching.